In this video, I am going to introduce you to a tool called Grasshopper. Grasshopper works alongside Rhino, and it is basically the visual programming interface for the software. So as you've done before, you don't need to use Grasshopper to construct something in Rhino, a model, a 3D model, or a 2D drawing or something like that. Grasshopper gives you a number of tools that allow you to do more complex projects. We're going to start off with some just basic kind of introduction to the software and how it works with Rhino. So I'm in a Rhino file, and I don't really need to save the name of this file or anything like that. I'm using Rhino just to sort of visualize what I'm doing in Grasshopper. So at the command line, you're going to type in Grasshopper, and it will open up a page that looks like this. So these are some prior files that I was working on. So those can be ignored, and we'll just begin to work with new components. For this first sort of set of conditions, I want to look at just simple points and how those are integrated with Grasshopper and how they are then visualized in Rhino. So I'm just going to move this Grasshopper window a little bit out of the way. Maybe you have, or maybe you haven't added a point in Rhino. Having a spelling problem here. Point, and then you're prompted to locate it, and you could give it, an XYZ coordinate, like say 10, 5, and I could give it a Z also, and it's going to construct a point floating in space. With Grasshopper, you can do a similar process. For example, so right now I am on the tab called Parameters, and there's something called a point. So if I click on that and I place a point in the Grasshopper window here, it's orange, which basically means that it doesn't have anything that it's tied to yet. But I can add things to it, and then they can populate. Now, there's a couple of ways to use this parameter tool to construct a point. One of them would be to right-click on it and set one point. Okay. Then that window is going to close, and now I have the opportunity of coming into the Rhino file and simply placing a point. Okay, so now this point, when I click on it, you can see it is highlighting the object, and we see the gumball appear. So it now has sort of a destination. Okay, now, right now, I don't really have any information about where it's located, but if I wanted to bring in a sort of a tool that would allow me to see what the XYZ is for this point, I can do that. One way to do that would be to double click on the Grasshopper screen and type in panel. Okay, so right now I have an empty panel, but if I come to this little tab on the side of the point and connect it here, it basically is identifying for me the X, the Y, and the Z. Okay, so for the time being, I'm going to disconnect this from point. Okay, so now it's just going to be a floating panel. Now that is basically the output. If I turn this into the input, I can double click in here, and I could reassign the point location. Let's say 10 and 4, and we'll leave it on the 0 Z-axis plane. Press enter. Okay. I'm going to click outside here, and now what I'm going to do is connect it to the point. And what you may have noticed is that it moved. Now this is an input, and I'm describing where this point is going to be located. So let's say I was to change this to 20. And you can see that the point is moving around. So I'm basically writing a script that says, put a point at this position in space. Okay, now that's one way to construct a point. And you can see I could do it without having created the point at all. But I chose at the first time to put the point in Rhino and then set it to the point. I could create a point. And again, I can either type in point here, or I can choose it from the ribbon. In this case, let's say I didn't want to set it. I can generate a panel, and this is another place to find the panel. Put the panel here and create another point. That's, let's say, 30, 10, 0. We'll leave this also on the z-axis. Now, as soon as I then connect it to the point, another point has appeared. Okay, and again, I can keep changing these values as necessary. There's another way to create a point. If you go to the vector tab and click on this one called construct point, and I'll place this one down here, you can see that there is a place to input the X, the Y, and the Z positions for that point. Now, instead of using an input panel like I did in the first example, what I'm going to use is something called a slider. For the slider, I'm going back to the params tab. And if you look at these input tools, there is one here called a number slider. And I'm going to place that one here. Okay, so what happens with the slider is you can shift the value like so, right? And it comes in with some default settings. If you want to change those settings, like you can see right now that they are at some form of decimal here. If I want to make it only whole numbers, I'm going to double click. So again, double click on this, on the slider portion of it, not within the sliding area, but where it says slider. Okay, I've got some options here. If I want only whole numbers, I can click on this N, which is, symbolic for integer numbers. And so it will only allow me to input, a 1 or a 5 or a 6. If I want to keep it in decimal form, I need to have it set to this one called floating point numbers, which is R, right? These two are for like only even numbers, only odd numbers, and we don't really have an instant at the moment that we would use that. But let's click on N so that it's going to be only whole numbers. And let's also establish some settings for the minimum and the maximum. We can leave it at 0, but for the maximum, let's change it to 10. Okay, so then the number could be any whole number between 0 and 10. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. All right, now what I will do then is, once I've got those settings, I'm going to make some copies of this. So I'm going to select it, Control C, Control V, Control V. So I've got one for each, X, Y, and Z. And what I can do now is come in here and connect them to those little ports, right? They're all set to 0. And you'll notice also on the screen that a point has appeared. What I can do now is take the slider and shift it in different directions to get the placement of the point where I would like it to be. I can raise it up also with this, the Z slider, but I'll keep that one at 0. So we're just working on the XY plane. But anyway, the sliders are pretty useful for being able to sort of change things quickly and visualize the change as you make it. Okay, so I'm going to eliminate one of these. I'll just click on these and delete them. So I've just got these 2 points. And so for this part of the exercise, all you need to do is make a screenshot that shows the Grasshopper window and the points as they would appear in Rhino. Perhaps you kind of shift your screen so we can see them in the perspective view.